John Bolton was not there yesterday at the DMZ. He was in Mongolia, but Ivanka Trump was there, the White House advisor, of course, the president's daughter. Ivanka was at her father's side, actually, for several meetings at the G20. And in a video posted by the French government, Ivanka is seen trying to make conversation with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, French President Emmanuel Macron, and IMF Chairwoman Christine Lagarde, as well as British Prime Minister Theresa May.
Social justice.
It's all, yeah.
As soon as you start talking about the economic aspect of it, though, a lot of people start listening who wouldn't otherwise listen.
And the same with the defense side, in terms of the whole sort of ecosystem. It's been very male-dominated.
That video and Lagarde's stare straight ahead went viral over the weekend, with some critics saying it exemplifies why the president's daughter should not act as a diplomat in international politics. Over the course of the trip, Ivanka participated in several bilateral meetings and, as you can see, was on stage for a women's empowerment forum and standing right straight in the middle next to the president of the United States in the class photo of world leaders. The White House posted also a video of Ivanka giving a readout of a trilateral meeting between President Trump, Indian President Modi, and Japanese Prime Minister Abe. Let's bring in now NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent, the host of KCDC on MSNBC, Casey Hunt, and political reporter for The Washington Post, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, and an MSNBC political analyst, Robert Costa. Good morning to you both. Casey, I'll start with you. Ivanka Trump has been at the president's side throughout this presidency, but perhaps over the last week, front and center more than we've ever seen her on the world stage. And again, standing in the middle of the class photo of world leaders.
Pretty stunning visual, quite frankly, Willie. I mean, and I think it says a lot about where the president puts Ivanka's counsel in his own esteem. I mean, she has, she walks into Oval Office meetings at will. She clearly has been elevated by him in this particular case. But that video that you showed, I mean, it's almost uncomfortable to watch. Yeah. It's like every teenager's worst nightmare, where you're trying to get a word in edgewise with like the cooler girls and they're just ignoring you. And I think that also says a lot about, how this administration relates to our allies and how they view what this president is doing. I mean, we've talked a lot about North Korea, and that's obviously an incredibly historic and important part of this. But think about what happened in the days leading up to that step into the DMZ. I mean, the president was joking around with Vladimir Putin about Russian meddling. He was shaking hands with MBS, who the world community has basically declared killed a Washington Post journalist and chopped him up into little pieces. He, of course, was meeting with President Xi of China. This has been another example of where this president has been out on the world stage, embracing traditional American adversaries as much as he has been talking with democracies. He seemed to misunderstand a question about Western liberalism from Peter Baker of the New York Times. Instead of talking about the West, he was talking about liberals in San Francisco, in an answer that I think a lot of us found really confusing. And I think the treatment that Ivanka got in that video, yes, we can joke about it, but I think it also underscores something much more serious.
Yeah, Robert Costa, this seemed like something different over the last couple of weeks, or last week anyway, at the G20, when they put the president's daughter out giving readouts of trilateral meetings. That's something new.
It is new to have a senior White House official and family member playing that role. For years, the president has talked about Ivanka Trump as being the future of his business brand and his business interests. Now he sees her in part as part of the future of his political brand. What's notable is that Ms. Trump has not shown an immense interest in embracing the president's nationalism on the world stage. She's very much more about engagement with these European leaders, building a rapport, and the president has this hardline, abrasive style with his diplomacy that she has not shown any kind of affinity for in terms of her dealings with world leaders. Yet the president believes that she could be the future not only of the Trump org, but of the Trump political brand. And he has even spoken to advisors privately and at times alluded to it publicly, that's at a post like the UN ambassador position in Turtle Bay. She could be in the running for that. He thought about maybe appointing her to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Elise, what do you think when you see these images of Ivanka front and center?
I absolutely can't believe it. Having served around so many incredibly talented diplomats and government officials, that she just gets to waltz up on the stage as if she's Secretary of State without any Senate confirmation process and has so much unadulterated power at her fingertips is really scary, because she's not a professional and she's in completely over her head. And you can see that from how other world leaders respond to her. And it's really sad and pitiful that the Trumps believe that nepotism on this great scale is acceptable for a country as great as this nation.
Her husband, Jared Kushner, also was in the room for that meeting with the dictator of North Korea yesterday along the DMZ. John Meacham, I want to play for you the soundbite that Casey mentioned a moment ago when the President of the United States was asked about the decline of Western liberalism, and then we'll give you a crack at it. Let's listen.
Do you agree with him that Western-style liberalism, as it's been defined over the post-war period, is now obsolete and no longer relevant to today's world?
Well, again, he may feel that way. I mean, he sees what's going on, and I guess if you look at what's happening in Los Angeles, where it's so sad to look, and what's happening in San Francisco and a couple of other cities, which are run by an extraordinary group of liberal people. I don't know what they're thinking, but he does see things that are happening in the United States that would probably preclude him from saying how wonderful it is.
John Meacham, your thoughts?
Wow. Okay. Well, two things. One of the great stories of this era, one of the great historical mysteries, is the Trumpian fondness for totalitarianism and dictators. The two things we have to explain is, why did a certain number of Americans want this reaction to the established order in 2016? And the second, one of this to be the second story, is given the what we just saw over the past 72, 96 hours with Putin, with Saudi Arabia, with North Korea. What is it about those regimes that is so attractive to Trump? There are certain self-evident answers that we don't even need to go into. On the Western-style liberalism, you know, perhaps he deliberately misunderstood that. You know, Dwight Eisenhower once was going out to a press conference, and Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, stopped him, and there was some issue in the news, and he said, "Mr. President, are you sure you know what you want to say?" And Ike said, "Don't worry, Jim, I'll just go out and confuse him." I don't think this was that.
Wasn't strategic, no.
I don't think this was tactical. So Western-style liberalism is really an Enlightenment era phenomenon. Goes back to the roots of it in the 17th century, most clearly in the 18th century. Rule of law, centrality of the individual, the role that free will and individual sovereignty plays, as opposed to orders that are run by hereditary authority and really superstition as well. Popes, prelates, princes were being toppled so that we would all have the capacity to determine our own destiny. Most clearly manifested in the Declaration of Independence, that we're all created equal. And the story of America has been how generously we apply, story of the West, not just California, has been how generously we apply that definition of human equality. So all governed by rule of law, free press, generally market economies, so that you have individual initiative that can shape both individual lives, lives of families, and that then the sum, the parts create the whole. That's the story of Western-style liberalism. Liberalism, in this sense, goes back to the 18th century meaning of the word, which is freed, which is actually a really conservative idea, that free men, in the language of that time, were the determinative force. So that's what the question was about. It was not about San Francisco or Los Angeles. And the fact that the president didn't understand the question may be all that we have to say about it.
And if you want to hear that excellent speech set to music, see John Meacham and Tim McGraw on tour, coming soon to a city near you. You actually watched that exchange between Peter Baker, who asked the question of the president, thought it was the most important of the last week. Why do you say that?
because there was a tie-in between the president not understanding what Western liberalism is, and that it reflects his approach both to American society, his attacks on the media and the courts, and also his total disinterest in a United States that stands for international institutions. The liberal world order is what we call this. This is what for 70 years has been the principal purpose of the United States in the world, to strengthen institutions, to limit what countries can do against human rights, to promote democracy and freedom in the world. And then you see the way he cozied up to all these authoritarians or dictators around the world. And to me, it made a peace, all against the backdrop of these Supreme Court decisions. This was not a good week for American democracy or American values, either here at home or in the world. And that exchange, to me, that you have a president, in some ways almost representing a society, Willie, that's not really familiar with civics, with our own DNA, who we are. Well, what we're now seeing are the politics at home and abroad from a president who who hasn't internalized the political DNA of this country. And I think we're going to live with the consequences domestically and internationally for some time to come.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, writer E. Jean Carroll was the 22nd woman to accuse President Trump of sexual misconduct in her case of rape. Why then are many evangelicals still standing behind him? David French joins us with his new column on that subject next.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.